All right, hello everyone. So this is the Rome and everything after Rome, where are we? Rubicon and everything after lecture with our 2-hour discussion to come. This is where everything is culminated. It is the actual literal crossing of the Rubicon and really where our narrative comes to a close, and we begin our final analysis to start today and also into next week with our more of our big picture analysis. So the way that this reading starts off, I picked it up in the Cassius Dio, talking about Milo. Milo was fighting Clodius. Cato had just recently returned from exile. He was off in Cilicia. As we remember from last time, Milo and Clodius were fighting each other. Clodius had even burnt down Cicero's house. In fighting between Milo and Clodius, the Senate house had burnt down. Rule of law, there was civil disorder in the streets, and as we are going to be seeing, there was breakdown of civil discourse and even the structures of the laws themselves. And for whatever reason, the underlying conflicts were so sharp that even when there were reasonable solutions at hand, these solutions were not picked up and carried forward. So Cato was supposed to be sitting as a juryman on this situation with the in the wake of the Senate House being burnt down, and Rufus and Plochus, I suppose, were the names of the men who were charged with all this disorder. And then Pompey was cooperating with them. Cato was trying to get them convicted, and there were laws. This is how tumultuous things were legally. There were laws that Pompey had passed where each party in a lawsuit was allowed to set aside 5 out of the number who were to judge him. So jury selection was the plaintiff and defendant were each allowed to select people on the jury. So it's the jury. Now our system, the plaintiff and the defendant have the or the state and the defendant have the right to remove people from the jury, but they don't select the jury. Here, people were selecting the jury. So this is Pompey was trying to have legal reform. The way it had been before was that wealthy people, the jury was selected from among the wealthy. So if you were wealthy, the jury would be on your side. If you weren't, they weren't. So he's trying to bring some to level the playing field here, but it's just kind of leading to stalemates. And after attending to these matters, they say in Cassius Dio, Pompey revived the law about elections which had fallen somewhat into disuse, commanding those who seek an office to present themselves without fail before the assembly in person. So this was a very big deal because Caesar was wanting to run for consul again. He had had 2 successive terms in Gaul. He was coming back from Gaul. He wanted to be elected to office, to obviously pass through some laws, to really to govern about. He just brought all this money in from Gaul. If he was going to be consul, he would be in charge of how that money would be spent. He could also do things, presumably, to indemnify himself against these charges where people would want to bring suits against him as long as he was no longer in public office. You have to remember that's the sword of Damocles hanging over his head and any other person's head who is no longer in office. So Pompey, however, made an exception to this law. Pompey and Caesar at this point were still on each other's side, even though Crassus had died. They were starting to be split from each other. Although he was allowed, Pompey made an exception to these laws, to the laws which he himself had passed, made an exception to these laws saying that Caesar could campaign. He could allow others to campaign for him, to canvass for him, to count the votes. So this was greatly criticized. And then it is saying here that Cato did not wish any office, but seeing Caesar and Pompey outgrowing the system of government, is how Cassius Dio puts it, and surmising that they would either get control of affairs between themselves or would quarrel with each other and create a mighty strife, the victor in which would be the sole ruler. Of course, this is 2020 hindsight. He wished to overthrow them before they became antagonists, and hence sought the consulship to use it against them, because as a private citizen he was likely to wield no influence. It had been said before that during the Catiline conspiracy, only Cato was free of personal motive. And here, the sense of emergency, panic in the face of emergency, is really a theme that characterizes this final, what I consider to be the final downfall of the Republic. That even someone so upstanding as Cato was in such a panic about the state of the Republic that he cloaked his serving of the Republic within his own personal interests, that he thought he couldn't do anything as a private citizen, so he had to seek office, he had to seek power, personal power, but it was for the good of the country. Even Cato was sucked into acting like this. So it is said that Cato's ambitions were guessed by the adherents of now the biumvirate, I guess you could call it. And Marcellus was the name of one senator who directed all his efforts to, as Cassius Dio puts it, compass the downfall of Caesar. Pompey was going to lead an expedition into Spain. Apparently there was some tumult in Spain, and this is another decisive shift. Instead of Pompey was always very excellent at leading expeditions. He was good at it. He probably felt more at home when he was on some type of military campaign. He doesn't do this. The situation in Rome is so dicey that he sends people to Spain instead of going to Spain himself, because Pompey is wanting control of the city of Rome. And now, becoming a private citizen is what none of the prominent politicians want. Here he goes on to say that Caesar was on no account inclined to become a private citizen after so great a command and one of such long standing, and was afraid that he might fall into the power of his enemies. So that sort of Damocles we're talking about. He made preparations to stay in office in spite of his enemies, collected additional soldiers, gathered money, manufactured arms, and conducted himself to please all. Caesar is trying to please all the people some of the time here, until he is backed into a corner and has to act decisively. Cassius Dio says he did not spare money since he could collect it from the people themselves. And this would be, Cisalpine Gaul, Gaul Narbonensis, and these recently conquered territories. Caesar was now able. He had effectively, this is an interesting perspective. I haven't heard many people bring it up like this, but Caesar was effectively making himself a king. He made himself a king of the provinces. Pompey was made imperator. He was given imperium, personal imperium over the east. And he didn't really go over there and take active rule of it. He kind of directed the money, probably. Caesar effectively took imperium. He started campaigns and wars of his own accord when he conquered Gaul the way that he did, and he basically bribed people to let them accept that he was taking these actions. So you could say that he was already behaving like a king or behaving like an autocrat. So Curio was a senator who began to or maybe he was a tribune. He's a politician, I should say. Curio was on the side of Caesar. Mark Antony steps to prominence here. He was a tribune of the people who was on Caesar's side and would go back and forth carrying letters, which comes into play. Caesar had quite a lot of followers here, and really Rome was split between the supporters of Pompey and the supporters of Caesar, and people like Cato, people like Cato and Cicero were the ones who were trying to stop this power struggle, because this power struggle was eventually what tore the Senate and the Republic apart. So even at this point, as these divisions are trying to come up, he's saying that Pompey before this, while he was still on friendly terms with Caesar, had given him one legion, composed of those troops which according to the register belonged to him, inasmuch as he was not conducting any war and Caesar had need of soldiers. But when they fell out with each other, his desire to get this back from him and to deprive him of yet another, he delivered a speech, stating that Bibulus required soldiers against the Parthians. And in order that no new levies should be raised, he said that they had an abundance of legions, that Caesar must send one. Okay, so at this point, and this is an interesting bit of kind of political trickery, these legions therefore apparently made war to be ready to be sent against the Parthians out in the east, but when there proved to be no need of them, there was really no use for which they could be put. Marcellus, fearing that they might be restored to Caesar, at first declared that they must remain in Italy. But then they were given to Pompey's command. So the Senate is so afraid of Caesar taking over that they call up legions. They pull legions away from Caesar's forces that are ostensibly protecting the frontiers. Meanwhile, there's some war in Spain going on. They could have sent those legions to actively be used in Spain. They didn't do this. Caesar himself would later go to Spain to take care of these various things. But they didn't do this. They pretty much lied and made up an excuse about Parthia, and then took the legion away from Caesar and then said, oh, look, we don't actually have a problem in Parthia. Oh, well, we can't give this back to Caesar because he's dangerous. Let's give this army to Pompey. They were finding a way to arm Pompey. Pompey was saying that he had so much loyalty among Sulla's veterans, and probably even still among the legions who had at one point served his father, but most of those men would have been dead by now. Pompey was getting old. But still, he commanded so much loyalty that he felt all he had to do was say so, and that men would follow him. But they were giving as many armies to Pompey as possible. So here we have the back and forth with Mark Antony. There was a letter that Caesar sends to Rome, in that he was heading back. He wanted to run for consul, and he said that he had a list of, he sent a letter with a list of all the great things that he had done for the Republic, all this money that he had sent, all this land that he had conquered, and he's saying that he would disband his army. And everyone was remembering Marius versus Sulla here, where they refused to disband their army. Caesar is saying, yes, I will disband my army. Now, what they were all afraid of, why wouldn't they just let Caesar disband his army? If Caesar disbands his army, runs for consul, and wins, then that would be considered a kind of soft coup. And all of these optimate senators did not want Caesar to be in charge of Rome. They feared what he would do if he was consul. Now, what he did to their interests when he was forbidden from being consul was even worse for them. They made a horrible decision. It brings to mind the John F. Kennedy quote, "Those who make peaceful change impossible make violent change inevitable." And that is a very, very good way of describing the recalcitrance of the Senate where these senators were effectively placing the noose around their own necks. But as we'll see from the Plutarch here, Caesar, whenever possible, was as merciful as possible. He knew how destructive civil wars could be. Everybody knows he saw enough of that kind of thing with the civil strife in Gaul, and remembered it from his teenage years when Rome itself had been burned. He wanted to avoid all that, but there was much stubbornness on both sides. He promised he would disband his legions and give up his office if Pompey would also do the same. And then there was a vote taken on this proposition. No one voted that Pompey should cease to bear arms, because, and this is key about those legions that were supposed to go to Parthia, Pompey had his own troops in the suburbs. So there was those who did not love Pompey feared him. So, unfortunately, and here you can see how something that was said by the founders of the United States, that it may have been Madison who said this, that standing armies are the enemies of republics. Here you can see this moment right here exactly how that happened. You had a standing army under the command of one man, and the Senate becomes rather spineless in yielding to the interests of this one man, much to everyone's detriment, including Pompey. It wasn't really helping him. So what the Senate does is they voted that Caesar should surrender his office and send away his legions by a given date, or else be considered an enemy of the people. When Caesar was informed of this, he came to Arminium, and then for the first time overstepping the confines of his own province. This is the moment of crossing the Republic. And he marched straight upon Rome himself, taking possession of all the intervening cities without a conflict. Garrisons of some abandoned them. So Caesar is going through the north of Italy, and he's basically not fighting any battles, but the people are either running away or going over to his side. So as he goes from town to town, Caesar's army is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, Pompey was not yet prepared to deal with this. This was all very slipshod planning in terms of Pompey. One would think that if they were so worried about Caesar, he should have sent something like what would have Gaius Marius done. Gaius Marius would have gotten some money together, pulled soldiers together, and gone straight up to confront and at least have a diplomatic talk with Caesar while an army was there. That would have been the kind of... You can disagree with the decision, but that would have been much better leadership than what Pompey did. What Pompey did was just kind of sit around, let Caesar take the initiative, which Caesar was a genius at. And then what he ends up doing is he ends up leaving the city. It says that Pompey was frightened at this, knowing that he would be far inferior to Caesar if they should both have to depend on the clemency of the populace. The people in the Roman countryside had been getting all this money sent from Gaul. All this government spending on their side, they would favor Caesar. And even more than others, they shrank from the war through remembrance of the deeds of Marius and Sulla, and wished to escape it in safety. So everyone had this in mind and wanted to avoid this civil war in the city of Rome itself, or even in Italy. So Pompey withdraws from the city of Rome, goes to Campania. He goes south along the Appian Way. He basically goes to vacation country. He takes his army and we have to remember that still today that's the resort towns down there. Even back then it was vacation country. He commanded the whole Senate together with those who held the offices to accompany him, granting them permission by a decree of absence. So he takes the Senate with him. Only the senators who supported Caesar and those who were neutral remained in Rome. So the Senate is acting in absentia outside of the city, traveling with Pompey, and they retreat. They surrender the city itself. You have to remember that it's really messed up for any kind of legitimacy, because you take the Senate, it's not, the standards didn't say SQR. They said SPQR, the Senate and the people of Rome. It was in a sense bicameral. You had the popular assembly, which could pass laws on its own. So if the Senate's gone, if the Senate's denied a quorum, first of all, there's the question of legitimacy about, well, is that a quorum? Can you have a quorum outside of Rome? Is the remnant, the rump Senate in Rome considered more legitimate? At the same time, if Caesar wanted to pass a bunch of laws, which he did propose, you could pass them through the popular assembly, which favored Caesar anyway. So again, this is a real political tactical blundering, as well as military tactical blundering on the side of Pompey. But they did so out of a kind of panic, a panic of civil war. Hence, they assumed and these are the people who were leaving, they assumed a twofold attitude in their decisions, in their prayers, and in their hopes. With their bodies, they were being drawn away from those nearest to them. Their souls they found cleft in twain. It's a very rare moment of dramatic rendering for Cassius Dio. So he's speaking. This was still somewhat of a fresh memory here about these people that they had to leave, and they didn't know what would happen. You have to realize that when one man left Rome, when Cicero left Rome, Clodius burnt his house down, and they wondered, they didn't know what was going to happen to them, to their estates, to their lands, to their relatives. They didn't know what was going to happen to the country. Pompey left the city, and when Caesar learned this, it said that he didn't hurry to Rome. He sent a letter all throughout Italy in which he summoned Pompey to a kind of trial. Caesar is being very, very tactical about this. He's painting himself as the good guy. He's painting himself not as the usurper, but as the one who is defending the laws. He's basically not going to Rome immediately to claim it as if he's some type of invader, but he sends out letters to all the cities saying, "Oh, Pompey, where are you? Hey, man, come by, let's talk. Why not?" That's the kind of thing that he's doing. Summoning Pompey to a kind of trial encouraged all to be of good cheer, bade them remain in their places, and made them many promises. He's being a politician. Doesn't that sound like a politician? He sent out he's basically saying, "Come on, Pompey, debate me. I'm going to do this for Rome. I'm going to do that for Rome." He set out, and this is an interesting story, he set out next against Corfinium, which being occupied by Lucius Domitius had not joined his adherents. And then, I don't know if that's in the... Yeah, what happened with Lucius Domitius is handled in the Plutarch, which we're going to get to. There's a bit of an interesting, an anecdote with that. And so then what he does is, Pompey doesn't show up, doesn't follow this summons, doesn't confront Caesar. Instead, he flees. He goes south to Brundisium, which is in the heel of Italy, and goes across to Albania and to Macedonia. He leaves Italy. Cassius Dio saying Pompey accordingly deserted in this way his country and the rest of Italy, choosing and carrying out quite the opposite of his former course when he sailed back to it from Asia. And here he says, instead of fame, which he had for exalting his country, he became most infamous for his desertion of it. This is continuing on in our reading on page 15. This is the Plutarch, saying that after Marcellus's consulship, Caesar began to lavish gifts upon all the public men out of the riches he had taken from the Gauls. So this is what's going on, is that Caesar knew how this worked. You have to remember, how did Caesar come to power to begin with? Running for a very low public office when he kissed his mom goodbye, and he says, "Mom, if I don't win the election, this is the last time I'll ever see you." You know, because he was so much in debt. This was how he understood politics. He was increasing campaign spending. effectively buying the office. And here he's doing this for buying a very high office, of being consul again. And here even Plutarch says, Plutarch, who's no fan of Caesar, Plutarch says that Caesar made the fairest colors of equity imaginable, for he proposed to lay down his arms, and that Pompey should do the same, and that both together should become private men, and each expect a reward of services from the public. There were too many people gunning against Caesar at this point to allow that. It wasn't enough that they could win. They were convinced that Caesar had to lose, and they tore down themselves in the process. So here's in Plutarch where they say that he's a public enemy. And after he's declared a public enemy, he doesn't invade. This is important. In Plutarch's chronology, they tell him that he's a public enemy, and after that, he keeps trying diplomatically. Caesar does not give up diplomacy. Afterwards, there came other letters from Caesar which seemed yet more moderate. He proposed to quit everything else and only to retain Gaul within Alps, Illyricum, and 2 legions. I wouldn't call that more moderate. Again, he's falling back on, he's basically showing them the power that he already has. Retain Gaul within the Alps, Illyricum, and 2 legions till he should stand a second time for consul. Cicero, the orator, who was lately returned from Cilicia, endeavored to reconcile the differences and softened Pompey. Cicero used his persuasions with Caesar's friends to accept of the provinces and 6,000 soldiers only. Pompey was inclined to give way to this, so there was a deal. A deal was made. But then, Lentulus the consul would not listen to this, but drove Antony and Curio out of the Senate house with insults, and they have to disguise themselves. In some accounts, they say that Mark Antony was disguised as a woman. That might be an exaggeration. Cicero later, the jokes that Cicero got killed for were when he said certain things about the way that Antony would behave towards Caesar and how much Antony would like it or not. But this is that kind of probably got caught up in saying that Antony dressed like a woman. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But what they say is that he fled the city in disguise. So Caesar is crossing the Alps. They take Arminium. Here we are with Domitius. Poor old Domitius. So this guy, when he's at Corfinium, it was garrisoned with 30 cohorts under Domitius's command. He, in despair of maintaining the defense, requested a physician whom he had among its attendants to give him poison. So he was too scared to... This in itself would have been considered real wimpy. You know, if you're going to kill yourself, fall on your sword like a good Roman. So he asks for poison, and taking the dose, drank it in hopes of being killed by it. But soon after, when he was told that Caesar showed the utmost clemency toward those he took prisoners, he lamented his misfortune. This is a great moment showing the type of panic that people were in. So this guy's panicking. He's like, oh no, Caesar's coming with his army. Oh no, I'm going to have to kill myself. This is going to be horrible. So he asks for poison, drinks it, and then people say, oh, you know, Caesar's not killing anyone. Oh my God. But then he lamented his misfortune and blamed the hastiness of his resolution. His physician consoled him by informing him that he had only taken a sleeping draught. So this was a sensible doctor. The guy asks his doctor for poison, and he's like, "Oh, okay, poison. Here you go." And he just gives him something to make him sleepy. And so he comes back, and he knew probably that this guy was not mentally with it, that he was panicking. So he didn't give him poison. He just gave him a sleeping drink. So this guy realized it wasn't so bad. Caesar came in and basically incorporated Domitius's forces into his own. And it wasn't an emergency for Domitius or for Domitius's men. And so this is that there, and it's interesting that this is in Plutarch, where he has this kind of these moral overtones to his anecdotes. That's that moment, which may or may not have happened. It probably happened. It sounds like it would have. But this is how bent out of shape and hysterical these men were. And in the in the old kind of sexist ways of saying it. The Romans at the time, and even 19th century historians would say, they're not acting like Romans, they're acting like panicked women. You know, people would say they're not even like, you know, and this might have been a point where Roman women would have said, you're not acting like men. You know, it's like the scene in The Godfather where he's smacking Johnny Fontaine, saying, "You can act like a man. Stop it." This was one of these moments of these people panicking, but you can understand why. You can understand why they would panic. I mean, how would any of us behave if you have to understand that Rome was being flooded? Rome was being flooded by refugees. There were people who weren't. So it's not that everybody supported Caesar. It's that anybody who didn't support Caesar was going to Rome, to Pompey. And of course, Labienus, Caesar's great friend and adjutant general, lieutenant general, basically had defected. And then he came to Pompey and told, now of course anyone who wants to defect from Caesar is liable to exaggerate. And so Labienus was probably exaggerating Caesar's intentions and Caesar's forces. Caesar certainly didn't act like a conquering tyrant, even though that's what everybody was expecting him to do. But to make a long story short, this is the moment where when Caesar does come into the city, he, on the bottom of page 18, he takes money from the public treasury. He basically gets a locksmith to break open the doors. I believe this is the Temple of Saturn where the public treasury was. Takes out the money. Rule of law is completely gone. Piety, religious piety out the window. This is pure, raw power. And basically the Republic has fallen at this point. And it didn't have to. But there were underlying forces driving it. And hopefully, we will come to some understanding in our discussion tomorrow of what those underlying forces were. And also to take a look at the timelines and to fill out the analogy and to think about how are we in relation to this. Our timeline is already divergent. How divergent is it? What kind of thresholds do we think that we are passing through? Thank you for listening.